Jusung Sanji Tom, Jijing over Don Jingor Jamze Jabda, Cutting Sume Tuki Dani, Kantam Chiti Jabo, Jimeta Neshida Chijeta Yampara, Zambisha Dora, Mame Bola, Govera, the Gurun Kubachin Bekuni, Ton, Takin Jabsenchi. Giovanni Turu Tomje, the Tukzewa Jimbeguni, Jesus on the so Kambisha Santa Vemanga, Petan the Medanda Chains, Message Center Saban to make it the teacher to Gindama, Kunicho, Jikan Sandia Kam, Chabeton, Pemakabe. Chapetrin Dolly in Sajo, Jensolan Bemedon Bazar, Devin under Judon, Sense of Bejan, that's all, but with Pemam June, Dal Penso. Come to God and can you go, and then when you go with the Nibutan, the baby Namjapa. Kunche Chuji Jabola, Sorvanda, Nilo Toba, everything Jala, Ganda Tujatonga Jidena, the Helona Jerva Kangsada, think the Tembichi Chambana, Nyambranda Batadan, the Shishi, like Kedamata, no Jinke, Tavamda, Mayikenamdi. Rawakundi Doge, Jineba, Tam Jake, the dog, Chuten, dos. Last time again, Chesola, Chushegi, she love you.
So the last thing I recited there said, I said, I'm now going to teach you the Dharma.
And so
I guess you all should reply, I'm going to listen.
Sanji gen dog nalola, and then Mompana, so chembo nabani, sapper jotes. Can't he na, can't he could be chewing chebata, can't he could be chew nyambaos.
In the sutras, the Buddha said in the future, there will be two great accumulations of merit. And so 2 ways to do that. And what are those? One is to respectfully teach the Dharma, and one is to respectfully listen to the Dharma.
Can't he could be chewing could be chewing, say that the Kubatela Kogore. I got a Kogore depend on Nanda Chigetani. Tumbadam, Tambala, Ani, Tebadam, Kuba. Chip Goni, and it then Zingyong Pesum Tiag Chede, and it chewed Hiena, and it gave a chimbo the Chagres, and the Kogores.
And so one thing when that's said, that respectfully explain the Dharma, or respectfully with respect to the Dharma, or with respect to the Dharma to teach, and with respect to the Dharma to listen. What is that respect to the Dharma? So it means that I have, as the teacher for the Buddha, as well as for the Buddha's teachings, I have faith and respect for those teachings. And through an attitude of great faith and respect, then if I were to, with such an attitude, then try to maintain, hold, and spread these Dharma teachings, then I will gather a great amount of virtue.
That's it. And this home Nada Jinata, Kasere. Namden de Tamba. Then it Zubi Sanji Jom Dendi down. Ani Denita Ramba Yinde. Anita Kase Jik Tatanga Soda Ujina that di. Oh, that's in Nanjurvike. Any young. Any that Dindige, any Kaseri, Tambatang, Tambate Sola. Degudong, give it Sojigoni. Any Shaggy Yola, the Chenamba Tendabuchi indoors.
And so, like for myself, I have a great respect for the Buddha of our age, the Buddha Shakyamuni, and his teachers and his teachings, and then gradually the teachings and teachers that have come down in his lineage, and particularly in our own lineage of the Nyingma, the early translation school. And so with that, I am teaching then out of that great respect and great faith in the Buddha as well as those teachings. And I suppose that you will all listen with such an attitude.
Anita, that the indigenous Kipigoni Chu Chebada Nyendo Dicala, Gevada, Chembo de Sando Huyore, Taina and De, Tipa Chimbi Geva Chahi, the Medene, Young Simki, you make it cheaper. Tapedi semje tamji dongan dravi cheda rangye semje tamji dongan dravi chedella ane kasere di chui de nguni rane gata chi rangla mena thab meju chi tendri chi la teni di samno tangni ane sem chi bi guni nyena ne tikhen ge ba chandum re de mena tikhen ge ba samyang teni di chag mares.
And so then, of course, if one does teach or listen to these teachings out of great respect, then that will bring forth a great amount of virtue. But whether that becomes what we refer to as virtues of the Mahayana or Mahayana virtues or not, depends upon whether that's done with the attitude of bodhicitta, whether one has that attitude of bodhicitta or not. And so we should be thinking then that we absolutely have to hear this teaching so that we will be able to use that as a tool, so that we will be able to liberate all sentient beings, ourselves and others, from suffering. And with that attitude, then the virtues that we gain here from teaching and listening to these teachings will become the virtues of the Mahayana. And without such an attitude of bodhicitta, then they will still be virtuous, but not virtues of the Mahayana.
Okay, understand? Let's say. Nanga so teaching ta geva se undu karsi or se do. Ti give it our tela techini ta. Nguse inanda, juni inanda. Kachenta chi rangena sanji chi kompon tuzegi jerndo sona. Teaching gets a chanu yore. Te majona ane teaching gets a chak yomares.
So what does it mean for something to be a virtue of the Mahayana? Like what does that do, or what's the point of talking about that? So if as a result of such a virtue, whether directly or indirectly as a result of that virtue, if that leads to the attainment of Buddhahood for oneself or others, then that virtue is what we call a virtue of the Mahayana. And so if the virtue is still virtuous, but is not a cause directly or indirectly of the enlightenment, the Buddhahood of oneself and others, then it's not a virtue of the Mahayana.
Okay. Di tikhen senanda sanji dripige ane uanto senanda sanji dripige ta ngaso semji uanto kanyemba tela ngaso ta lam sikidwa ta sanji tubje ta uanto karkaranga chekona ta kachi uanto tela ani ta lam sigre sa sigre ta karsena desege yoreda.
And so when we're talking about this Mahayana virtue, or what we could refer to as a path, and when we're talking about a Mahayana path, what we're talking about is state of realization, or a state of mind which will lead one, which itself serves as a cause, or which itself will lead to your enlightenment. And so that's what we refer to then as a path. When the word path gets used in Buddhism, it means a state of mind and a realization in your mind that will bring you to enlightenment. And so that's what we refer to as a path. That's also what when we talk about the bodhisattva bhumis, or the bodhisattva levels are states of realization in someone's mind, which those states of mind, those states of realization are leading them to enlightenment.
And then this one da ker gogoya jila ta namba digi nanglo la chi sangji singen de ani ngaso kasereta sem de yajin ro senanda sem ani chi sem ga rangin chetawa yin la tane ya hlap thbyak tada ngaso rangin le ma chro la jordi yore Di rangin chetawa yin ro thbyak jigla ani sangji se ma do yang chi ka sen choba da cheung du chi wang chimbo chi ya len ro me so do den ri ki ja he him do ko sem de yajin ro se na yanda sem nyungman ye semli chro de jo songbala la ya ka se ko ranging to rota undukala, and a chick sanji sage, or the tended quality.
And so one thing that we need to understand in the present context, of this kind of level of Buddhist thought or inquiry, is that when we talk about Buddhahood or Buddha, what that means is, we can think about it as a fully developed state of mind, or we can think about it as arriving in the genuine nature of your mind just as it is. So right now we have gone outside of that. We have gone transgressed or gone beyond, gone outside of the realm of the nature of our minds. And so when we talk about Buddha, then that means one who has arrived in that state of the nature of their mind. And so it's not as if we do some Dharma practice and then some powerful being like pulls us out of suffering and brings us into some state of Buddhahood, but rather that there was this original natural nature of our mind, and we have gone outside of that. We have stepped outside of that. And when we arrive back in that nature of our mind, then that means that we have become Buddha.
Oh, let's say that in this home, that Tinder would then same good that the Rambata that red Tinder with Takas is same day, that same the Lojunji on the Gabla. Tela tako rumbaji good digre, tako rumba mebaga yungumarabas, tatela ko rumbaji good digiores.
And so when we're talking about that mind and that kind of mind that could come back to its nature or could develop or whatever, and so we have to apply some training to that mind. And so there have to be stages to that training or stages of the progress of that mind.
Okay. Then the Ramba de Gund, the Ramba de la Anita, Lam Nanda, which is Senata, then the Yagiore. Then it Lam or Lam As and out the Yagiores, or Tatamboteji, on the Gala.
And so when we talk about these stages, the first presentation we're going to talk about is the presentation of the 5 paths. So these 5 paths are 5 stages of the mind.
Let's say any that ring the Vala di Casiri Pechachi, then Tangyayore, any Chenabaga Telechi, Ziketini, Naruna, say in a negative, the Sama He, then I saw to say Yunkumanda, and it is coaching Duba, which my He Yagos.
And so today, for this present teaching, there was a text posted for you to look at on the website right next to the Zoom link. So if you didn't already get that, you should open that and have a look at it. And so that's going to talk about some of the topics that I'm going to be talking about today. And so I'm not going to be able to go through every word of the text, but I'm going to give some summations of what's found in that text. So if you just kind of keep referring back to the text, it'll be helpful.
I said that the Nasotada the Nangaso Heda non a Hedeg. And Jigling Caseon, the Yunden Zuk. And then Dreva, digging Manolate Yaparesilla.
And so these pages that we extracted and posted as this PDF are pages that come from the text from Jigme Lingpa called The Treasury of Precious Qualities, which is the book that we study in our Ewam Shedra program.
Okay. I need that digital days and Tiku Kasin Tapa, the Wichako na young, and it's in about Tutu, some here, oh, that. So this is going to be a pretty detailed and pretty difficult kind of discussion, but just try and get a good general understanding kind of what's going on. The Mambochi de Mashivachi, Lundua, and it is on Rambachi, Yabachi, Pembaina, oh, the DJ and Dua, somebody young, so good, Jiachi or us.
And so my point in even giving this presentation and talking about this topic is that for people who are practicing for long periods of time, who have been engaged in the practice for a long period of time, they need to understand that there are stages of development that they'll go through. So by understanding this type of presentation from the text, you can kind of see where you're going. You can see that there are stages of development for you to go through.
Okay, let's say that in this song that didn't know that lam not ten you be known lam tambo de la solam se. Nipa de la jolam se, samba de la tonam se, yiba de la gomnam se, ngaba de la malab lam se ne, tenichini that remark ngayore sila.
And so within this, there are the first presentation is of the 5 paths. And so the 5 paths is in that appendix 6. There are 2 short sections of text in there. And so in the 5 paths, we have the path of seeing, the path of accumulation, the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and the path of no more learning.
Let's say, oh yeah, that didn't know that tamboji ngasota lam tambo de la tsuki lams.
And so the first of those 5 is the path of accumulation.
That tsuki lam seundu da ngasope da tusum so jebigeta tsuksakpa tsuksakpa ge yenda wuchi. That did you call a gom de some jab to yomare, Castle Lamramba tambo tereba. Gong tendig no like to go mare, any castle tipachea, sambacheva, taking the lu, nga, ye some, any castle gave out us a gave out us a pangni, or tendig in the tsusapina, and in the tsukilamse.
And the reason why it's called the path of accumulation is because we are primarily working on generating the accumulation of merit and so forth. So we are working primarily through hearing, contemplation, and some meditation, but our meditation can't really reach very profound levels at this point because we're still kind of beginners because this is the first path. And so we're working on, gathering and accomplishing, practicing the virtues of body, speech, and mind, abandoning the non-virtues of body, speech, and mind, and hearing and contemplating these teachings of Dharma primarily.
Oh, Tanya Tarin going here, so Maupana Tsukchimona Bani Sapan Jote say, Tanaga Tsusagado, Churonsong Tsusagado was. Yet that is outside. That Churonsa Tada Gigi Sakado.
And so, there's, just as I said at the beginning of this, the quote from the Buddha that said, in the future, beings will gather 2 great accumulations of merit through teaching and by hearing or studying these Dharma teachings. So, I've already studied so many of these, so I've gathered some of that accumulation. And you guys, some of you are very new to this, so you're just starting your path of accumulation.
Oh, that bit tender what that's who you love sound. That bed tibachi, sambachi, young dinam the desicas, gomja, or tende, sinitaka chen, namdrug lamla, that tambo and joke to your taco. Tela, the tambo, that did it, namdrulam, tambo to be good out the did it.
And so this is like, in this path of accumulation, we're primarily hearing the teachings, contemplating those teachings, and beginning in bits of meditation. And it's like the entryway. It's like the first step that we make on this path of liberation.
That's Sanji Tubzich. Then it gave a tambo side dibanda say, Yenda Tendigal Sunkudwa. That's Sanji Tubzig, that gave a tambo getting that side diba. Then a long coma get that Tubzig Jichaba, and the Jilla.
And so in some texts, they describe the path of accumulation as the first path, which is the path of gaining these virtues, is the first of the paths which will be a cause of your attainment of Buddhahood.
Oh yeah, that is Solom singing the pena pena that is one to Tangarang Jula pena that Solom which you the make it tend out there. Narang then the Kadijabas Ben and Nanda, which Sancho just him Tambo Jeba Lion, the Hijavure. That didn't keep on Damadag, the Hindamandare. Kashi Jig took Jeba on the Matsepa Jig, Kunzo Sancho just him Jula Jesumba, Ella Solom said. That Jeba the Jevani Lugarvala, Jeba say on the Tambo Susu same Jegi. Yes, on the decode Lugiore. That didn't hit this jab there.
And so what is the point at which, the level at which one could say, one has that state of mind, which could be described as the path of accumulation. When does one have that state of mind or state of realization, which is counted as the path of accumulation? So at what point could you say you're on the path of accumulation, to boil that down? And so there are lots of different scholars who explain this in different ways. So some of them explain it as the first time that you have brought up or generated the attitude of bodhicitta in your mind. Others go a step further and say it's not just that you have developed the intention, but not only have you kind of made that the intention, but it also has fully penetrated your mind. Like it's not just that you think about it and you think, oh, that's a good idea, but like actually that has become part of your being, that has naturally arisen within you, not just forcefully thinking about it.
Oh, I say that kachenchi muni tanigeta penata sancho sem 당부 다 톡 쟁해지 이네 zon데네 다 빼할 레버지래 봤다 베네 산지 좀 된데 토마르 장조지도 톡제만이 산지지기 받을라 되니 다 로여래 봐 딘도보다 토마르 다 샘제 탐지기 던들라 되니 다 가세레 디지 샘제 탐지 동안에 드비 체들라 아니 톡제만이 제나야 다 레야게 다 같이 기비 잡아 Tendri ta kasere ndono ne pe masimo mo song yore ta ngaso ta dana ko ye thumenwa pe tendri dana halle ta ko nguni chi ta che meju do chi re o tendri ge thoma che ba ina ya ta halle bo do chi res.
So even just the initial generation of the attitude of bodhicitta, the bringing it up in your mind, like thinking about that and like generating that is incredibly virtuous. So, in the Buddha himself like had to at one point have first started with his first arising or first generation of the attitude of bodhicitta, and that carried him forth all the way to the point until he attained Buddhahood. And so even from the very beginning, our first time like generating this thought of bodhicitta, of wishing to liberate all beings from suffering, that is incredibly great power of virtue. The Buddha in the sutras speaks at length upon how incredible and limitless the virtues are. We don't have time to get into all of these quotes from sutras and so forth, but anyway, it's an extraordinarily vast, limitless amount of virtue, even just to have the mere thought of bodhicitta.
Ani da tyonjog nung do chi da changchu simpa se sem kema thakbala dene sanji thamji gi thog si changchu simpa chandu re song ne tha ji ni song yo da.
And in the Bodhicharya Avatar, the way of the Bodhisattva of Shantideva, he says that, the point that one becomes a Bodhisattva, he says, conclusively in that text, that as soon as you have generated the mind of bodhicitta, that you become, an heir, a child of the Buddhas, you become a Bodhisattva.
And
so I'm here to the Garden of a Thousand Buddhas.
This Sanji Tong, the so Tamchi Yang, that really in the Tok Tambo Kadike, you mean, then the Kazang Nanola, then it's song your race.
And then, here we have this garden with 1,000 Buddha statues in it. And so there's these 1,000 Buddhas. And the stories of how each of those 1,000 Buddhas generated bodhicitta in the very beginning, the first time they generated bodhicitta, the stories of all of those are included within the Sutra of the Fortunate Eon.
Oh, let's say, Tenita, Kachenchi, that Sancho Sem, Jeba Inanda, Jiba Inanda, Kachenchi, Muneta, Sancho Sem, Jeba Sanchi Guneta, Muniti, Sancho Sumba Chandoya, that song yogare, Takachen Tini Zonde. And then I saw that Sanjiji Badila, Rome, the Tela, and it took your lamse, or that the Yana and the Dose.
So anyway, we can talk about that, as I said before, either as having merely generated the mind of bodhicitta or having it fully arisen within your mind stream, like in a natural and continuous way. And regardless, it's incredibly virtuous, and that from the moment we generate that, then we are on the path of accumulation, which will lead us all the way forward into Buddhahood.
Oh, let's say,
so I'm just going to leave it there.
Korang la yang ani da cholam tangbo chunga singech. Ani dinin ringbo singech. Ani dini chembo singe korang la ya da rebasom rawaji yore.
And even within the path of accumulation itself, it's subdivided into three parts, like the beginning we could say the beginning, middle, and end of the path of accumulation.
아니 근데 송잔다 가정 제당 가서데 되네 렘바 녀버 잡아 여 되네 루처 샘 추기다 디 렘바 녀야데 아니게 가정다 솔롬 충을 데 공그레세지 가정지 휴인바시.
And so last time I taught last month, we talked about the four close applications of mindfulness. Here in this text, they have it just translated as four close mindfulnesses. But anyway, last month, I told you that those are practiced in the first part, or what we call the small. It can be also talked about as small, middling, and great parts of the path of accumulation. But anyway, that the four close applications of mindfulness are practiced in the first section of the path of accumulation.
다제당 솔롬 충을라다 제베나 다 곰야 빼 마시만 보여라 제당 게다 고지 어레 제당 곰야다 빼만 보여 때라다 티몽다 티몽 많이 비기다 니 야운데 다 티몽 많이 비기 곰자 쳐바데 다다디 데마니 야라서 바니 다다 헤디진 소타데 다니 다 가정 데마니 야헤히요레 다니 아니 다 양다 뽕이 헤히요레 데서 탐지 티몽 많이 바레 마도 티몽 그때는 다 곰자 빼는 더 자해 동 또모그니 몰라서 봤더니 디 지된 돌아서 봤다 빼 마지막보다 곰야 참아 요레스라.
And so even in the small path of accumulation, the first part of that path of accumulation, there are so many different things to practice, so many things to meditate on, and those are divided into the common and uncommon practices. So the uncommon practices are, like, for example, what I talked about last time, the four close applications of mindfulness, and today's topic, which is the four perfect abandonments. And so those are the uncommon or the special things to be meditated on. And the common ones, there's so many more. There's all the particular antidotes to all the different afflictive emotions of attachment, aversion, ignorance, and so forth. There's another practice called the 6 remembrances. And so anyway, there's so many more different types of practices, which are referred to as the common practices within the small or the first section of the path of accumulation.
아니 다 네 저런 손라지 고대보 용야치 등의 빼지 야니마 다 솔럼 고대 마지 얘기.
So to make this a little more simple, I'm going to give you an example about how we can understand the path of accumulation.
아니 다나 나왕길레이세 다네 메인팅 나왕길레인다레.
So my name is Ngawangelek.
아니 다 빼가를 야나 아니 저런 손대서 고골리사그라마도 양아디 솔람이 나 솔람 쳔보이 중인 링보이 때솔로 그 메다스.
And so I'm going to give you an example about me, Ngawangelek. Otherwise, I'm not going to say like, oh, let's take an example of me or some person who's on the path of accumulation and that I'm at the first or second or middle. I'm not going to get into any of that.
된데 송단 다 빼는 나디 가정다 솔럼 중어 임바이나 아니 다가 빼는 심계기 쳐버때다 장정주도 톡게 연나ян다 심 군접 심지 줄게 차연한다 같이 된다비 강사되지.
So let's just
say 냠내 쪼고대다 초사야 돼서 빼 투성 그거는 쪼고 초사야 돼 전부 지지.
And so let's just say that I'm someone who's on the path of accumulation, the beginning part of the path of accumulation. And so, we can think of that as whether I've just merely generated the mind of bodhicitta or whether I have fully developed that and fully integrated that mind of conventional bodhicitta. Either way, I'm doing that and I'm practicing gathering the accumulations primarily by way of hearing and contemplating the Dharma.
아니 체퍼 그 곰자 쳐봐들라다 솔럼 충은다고 지나 당아 솔럼 충을럽대 바이나 아니 템바니버 잡아서 내가랑 르라 따니 아니 가세레 근접되더니 르테서 탐지 직다 맞아미 나바다 호는다 지마타바다 호는다 던덤데 아니 가세레 똥니고 따 대나기 서발라 따 샘라 따 추라 따니 같이 군접데 지마다만라 다 던덤데 때네 똥이 그거라 다 가지를 투som제야 투바제야 삼바제야 다 가세 투도 냠바른 줘봐 어떤데스 제니 당아 처럼 충급슬 텐데 용구요레스.
And so then my special things that I could be practicing or meditating on and practicing then are these 4 close applications of mindfulness. So I look at my body, and in my conventional understanding of my body, I can either see the impurity of my body or I can see the illusion-like nature of my body. Whereas ultimately I see the emptiness of my body, or I see my body as being emptiness. And that goes the same then for my feelings, for my mind, and for other phenomena. And then so I'm primarily, hearing, that means kind of studying teachings on these topics, contemplating those, and then to the best of my ability, applying myself in meditation on those topics.
Okay. Ani ta dig kapsalata nga tsulum chung yinza ani ngi maung pana julam ta lam ni ba tere ba la nga ta tsulum pare ba.
No.
Ta lam ni ba de tene di thab mathab la nga ngi ba yo mar ta. Ngi ba mi bi kaw de ta tu tsulum chung kapsala ta ni ngi ge mare ngi deso chegi yore ina nga di maung pana tene julam te thuk yoda meda mangi bi kaptena tsulum chung senduk yore.
And so at that point, I'm on the first part, or what we call the small path of accumulation, the first path of accumulation. And what that means is that at that point, there's still no certainty that I'll ever make it to the second path, which is the path of joining. And so there's still no certainty about that because I'm still on the what we refer to as the small path of accumulation. And at that point, it's still uncertain whether I will ever make it to the second path of joining.
Ta nga taron mentu ni tende chini nyamna che undu kala pansam che la tene tsolam ta topa de ya kongphan ro ya de kabla ane nga cheba ndela thuku yo mare te cheba jima namse ta nga di jolam te thap dene di ngeche ji chando di kabla ane di tsolam ringbo se du yo ta
Khen Rinpoche de chewa de dan chima de ya ngeya puko chuma son la de. Yang ju
ana chewa luten digi tenla nge di jolam thap thuku mare
la sa
raba ta chung kapsal athap mata khorong nge he ya mare ba ta
la sa
ringbo kapsal nge du yo re ina yang dik tenla nge he ya mare ta nge chewa di jima ra chi ni ani ngala di jolam thap ro ya ga ta ka sele nge ba ji chi hong di kala jolam ringbo solam ringbo se du yo re.
Okay. And so that the nge tharong go chu mendo
na se
di chewa nga chi ko de chewa di chi ni ki ko de chi chewa de gi chi jolam thop mi thup te
ala ta ka se di chewa ndele jolam thap nge che cha so na tene solam chembol lap sare solam chembol ra la de che un da nga so ringbo he go ra ba
lao
Rinpoche di tarong di chewa yenda ga par chwe du go yor ta par chwe na ma du thap tu ku yo ma re ka se nge gi ta nyamle ge ro ma thap re ba ta ko nyamle ge tsa de ga sa ma du ro tu ku yo ma re ta di song ta ko ta ti jolom di thap du ku yo re ina ta chewa ndela ta ko thap re ta re ba ko nyamle ge ro ma thap re ka te sik pa nga chewa ndela thap thu nge ji cha so na di tene di cholom chemo cha sa re 다 솔롬 첸랭 총성 그 최야고를 때래
디다레 데 지 제와 충정 얘기 제벌 고추만 손라
충의 값을라라 다 마음발 땅아 졸음 아타마타 다 고고 말해다
나오
다니 망이 버려다 다 남제기 체나 나 제와 늘라다 투고 말이지 제와 지만 남설에 졸음은 로 투고 오나 Okay.
So we're talking about the difference between the small and middling paths of accumulation. And so in the small path of accumulation, one is unable to, or it's uncertain whether they'll ever make it to the path of joining or not. But if at a certain point their level of practice, their realization gets them to the point where in their next lifetime, they would be able to make it to the path of joining, but in this lifetime, they would not be able to, then that's the middle path of accumulation. And then if we make it to the point where in this lifetime, we could still make it to the path of joining, then that is the greater path of accumulation.
So that they
ngadi chik drink tang che ni de yang chik lap short.
No, la se ore, ta ta re, ta chewa de ta lubdi kabla, teni nga chewa diki taina ta di kasri jolom lan ro thodu yorta. Ta tendre sa jela teni ta solom chemos la du yorta.
So the point, which is referred to as the greater path or the greatest path of accumulation, means that in this lifetime I can make it to the path of joining.
La se, ani tende sonza da nge kachong kare hiebare se nga solom chunga imbache.
So anyway, what I was saying,
timu maimbate remba nyeba yapa yehi. Ta tere nga ta ningbo da wati cheni, ani gomja timu maimbate yangda pungi te ma hiegi inse.
So what we talked about last month was that I was, for example, a practitioner who's on the path of accumulation. And in that time, I was on the small path of accumulation, meaning the first of the three parts of the path of accumulation. And my special practice, which I was working on, was the practice of the 4 close applications of mindfulness. And now we're taking that example further and saying, now we've made it onto the middle path of accumulation. And now my special practice is the 4 perfect abandonments lesson.
Okay. Ani da chen number di yangda pungi te le teni chik dana pesha tangya yo te chik ziru na se.
So now we're going to be talking about the 4 genuine restraints, which is on the second page of that Appendix 6 section that says the 5 paths and 37 elements. It's at the top of the second page.
Na se. Ta di yangda pungwa yete la ani dikpa magibi chu machipa mechibi tsar dimba jedo bedo zundu zamo sen rabden zindo sen rabden juko se ta pena yugno ne tangbo de ne magiba machipa teso mechibi chedela ani di namba ye otitene gogre sela
La Khen Rinpoche di yongzo di German do di tes chik dodo dao chi teni jordo la teni
ale la se anita derewala ta pena ngaso di dikpa magivili teso machiba teso macheba ya dang reba ani cheba teso tanji junjo ya ti nyinge
teni reba
machiba macheba che da cheba teso junjo ya zondo ti nyinge.
And so the first of the 4 genuine restraints here is the preemptive halting of negativities not yet generated. So preventing yourself from doing things that you haven't done yet. And the second is the rejection of, or the cutting off of, the stopping of negativities that you have been doing or that you've already done, not continuing forward with them.
Yang de na yin give chu machi ba de so tamki ki ba zoya tang ki ba de so compare zoya.
And then the second 2 are about wholesome states, positive states. So it says the third is the solicitation or the generation, we could say, of positive states that you haven't yet, it says here, which are not yet present, which you haven't yet engaged in or developed. And the fourth is the protection from decline of positive states already generated.
So, tan dot du sona game geni vendwa.
So anyway, to summarize that, we're talking about virtue and non-virtue, or wholesome and unwholesome actions and mental states.
Tenda songda belenga so ta geva teso tamchi machi ba teso or tambo dikpa de heguda. Dikpa machi ba teso tamchi ko tambo machi ba che. Che ba de ji change de so pa jun jue ya de che ge do ko le la bore do.
So it's pretty simple, right? First, when we're talking about non-virtues or unwholesome states and actions, then we try to prevent those ones which, let's say we have something that we've never done before. We continue to prevent that from ever happening or from ever coming up within us. And the things that have already come up within us or that we have already engaged in, we cut them off so that we don't continue them in the future. And similarly, with virtues, then we take the ones that we have not yet generated, we try to generate them. Like, for example, if we don't have any trust or faith, or if we don't have any compassion, we try and develop those qualities. And then the ones that we have already developed, we try to increase them even more.
Na se ta de la ta nga so de mikpa ase ta mikpa de game give ni la me gundu kala te la mikpa ase ta mikpa ta namba de so kandre se gorwa la mikpa de game ge ni la mikpa de ta namba de ti u ni ma chi nge yang che shi ge yin se.
Renee, that has nothing. That's just on the same page. Like what we're talking about starts from the Dharma of realization on the middle of that page, and then what we're talking about right now is a few pages into the text that you downloaded in the section called Appendix 6, the 5 Paths and the 37 Elements Leading to Enlightenment, and on the second page of that at the top where it says in the middle level of the Path of Accumulation.
Okay.
So here what we're going to talk about is in the 4 genuine restraints is the first we have to have something that practice is focused upon, and then a way in which it conceives of those things. So what it is focused upon is virtue and non-virtue, and then we'll talk about the way that that's practiced, or the way that you conceive of virtue and non-virtue in a minute.
Let's say any dana di kazirin dumba che dom bedo seni di namba ngatin duela.
Dimandula.
Ale la se ale la se
Ming den so de tang de do deni ole anchik degran deni chi chewa nam do.
Ale la se ore tangi diko de te se chita rehe ma jamna anita namba ten rehe jamna ani churong so te skoti sabopa kongre ani te hiegi insila.
So I'm going to explain a bit about, so we're focusing on virtue and non-virtue, and then how that focus happens, or how one conceives of those things. And I think it'll become clear for you what these 4 genuine restraints are.
Oh, la seta, tenda sondan kala ta chetang ki geda mge se de ta kari chila geva si yore kari chila mge si kore ndawochi tambo sama tangora was.
First of all, we need to think about what's meant by virtue. What's meant by non-virtue? What do those terms refer to?
And then den gombo ledog. Then uma ring chen tingwale. Then the cha hedong tamosum techi lin mgebaos. Macha madam tamome techi lin gebaos. Then chi songyore.
And so in the guide Nagarjuna, in his text, which is called the Precious Rosary, it says, the Precious Garland, I think it's translated as in English in a couple times. So he says that attachment, aversion, and ignorance and the things that come from them are non-virtuous. Absence of attachment and absence of ignorance and absence of anger or resentment, and the things that come from those are referred to as virtue.
That's it. The cha me hedang me tomo me big that pe sem sadang tigla anika se chetang gata ko geva se.
So like if we have a really clear state of mind which is free of attachment, free of anger, free of ignorance, then that's what we can refer to as a virtuous state of mind.
And that de mind ba chi the cha hedong that the most on the tacope masar barava cope de mongbaji rava that this symbol is chona and mageva so.
And then on the opposite side of that, we have those states of attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And in this context, when we say ignorance in terms of the 3 poisons, what we mean is a state of dullness or lack of clarity. And so those are referred to as non-virtuous states.
That's it. Yeah, that dig any negata game say. And
so that's just a brief little kind of summary of what's virtue and non-virtue.
Ta dan di the yanda pongwa yug no tana the namba. Ta tari de take the vala ta got me parava namba. Namba de chirumba ngada yayore. That nagnoni tango de la then dimba chedo se choreta. Same dimba. Give up Grubialan dimba. Mageba Pungyala and dimba chedo se chure.
And so when we talk about these 4 genuine restraints or 4 genuine abandonments, the focus is upon virtue and non-virtue. And then when we talk about the way that those are conceived of, and there are 5 stages or 5 points in that. And the first is the genuine wish. And so you have this genuine intention or wish to develop virtue, to abandon virtue, and so forth.
Let's say that the Dimbachi he be turned out de carried then they like ye cheaper chair. Co game mugi carina, co the mugi bare. The gevare senita, game mugi nipotelata, ye cheaper zoyanda utila, Dimbachi dos it, I mean, Naba Tambotilla, getting la ye cheaper zoyanda utere.
And so what that really comes down to, and what that really means when we say to wish for that, or is that you believe in it. You actually trust or have belief that virtues are something to be abandoned. Virtues are things to be developed, and you believe in the idea of virtue and non-virtue, basically. And so that's the first way that these four restraints are conceived of.
Let's say, Tang Songata, ye chitong kandachegore, Tangi is.
So now I want to tell you, how do we come to believe that? How do we come to have trust in that or belief in that?
And it in this home that pena, the not that he has had Tamchi Chenabata's gom jungi indoor tank to Samaraba. Tapena Chenaba Hini that he carried gongona. And it chiron so Hini go Yimbala, Pe Kongru Hedang Lonsona. Hinile de took do it. And then the child pe shukchamoji samba yosuna, Hinide let need to do it. The Mogum Masarbaji Chaswine need to do it. Oh, is.
And so now I'm going to explain that a little bit. So I assume, for example, that most of you are meditators. And so I think I could suppose that. And so let's say you're trying to practice some meditation, some calm abiding meditation. And as you're meditating and calm abiding, if you get angry, do you think your mind is going to be able to stay in that state of calm abiding? Is your mind going to be able to rest in its object? If you start becoming overwhelmed with desire or lust, is your mind going to be able to stay with its object in that calm abiding? Is it going to be able to rest in its object? Similarly, if your mind becomes totally unclear, if this ignorance or lack of clarity or mental dullness comes up, are you going to be able to stay in that state of calm abiding? So that's what I mean. And so for me, this is just one way of talking about this. For me, I can't stay in my meditation when those come up. Those become obstacles to my practice. And so that's one way from which we talk about the three poisons as being non-virtues.
Oh, tangala dig docho machapa madangba. The moment yobaina, tangi same de pechico round of masoni gana kansam journey. And I so solo pechi send the la pecas sebalosena and dra. A carisena coaching semna yajin roya.
And so the opposite, though, if my mind is free of these thoughts of free of attachment, free of resentment or anger, and free of that mental dullness and stupidity or lack of clarity, and it's free of those states, then I have a certain amount of kind of power over my mind in that, a certain amount of control of my mind, and can remain in a certain amount of, to a certain extent, in a state of relaxation and have control over that.
Oh, that's it. Anything this song that chain of a gom jungeti by ina. And it did join the matabna young gom the jug renkatela. And re gom jug yimbi gangdana. And it is so mapachi in the day go yobati tanga so hakoda, kota yichi tere. Oh, te yona ngatan yung maridas. This one ngata the gompa dudukala, me de some checking at begging the sunny. They meaning ilana pache chindore sunny.
And so if you're a meditator, then as you start to meditate, then you should gain that trust or that belief that these non-virtues are going to interrupt your practice, that you're not going to be able to practice if those non-virtuous thoughts are coming up in your mind. And so therefore you should know that you need to cut off the stream of those thoughts before you engage in your practice, because you know that they're going to be obstacles to you.
That's all. That data mikpa tangbo de kare that di yichiba tere, pangyanyala yichiba tere.
And so the first of these five ways that we conceive of these virtues and non-virtues is the way of trust or belief. So it is that wish to abandon, which is kind of contained within the idea of having belief in the principle of virtue and non-virtue and how they function, like what they are.
Number o ta nge se ming ba jeni ta ta ka se gedek ning ge panglang ning do wa panglang ni gi thola ta ka se sem de ya ji ni de sem de ming ba jeni de ma yang de ga la de la de ni di number ni ba de la tam be do se ti ming ba ji bi number ming ba ji ya de
gedek thone
no re ta ante ta di ka se ni de ba la di ka de gong ko de nga so yang da pong ji gong ko de ba
no
gedik ni de ba ta ka se gedik ni gi thu dna ani ka se di pang ge yin
no
o di che gi se ne di thu la de ne ko se ma yang ji de
Okay. And so here, remember that we're still talking about the four genuine restraints. And so the second of these five ways that we engage these virtue and non-virtue is with the second one is literally called making effort. But what that means is to be undistracted in your approach towards abandoning non-virtue, developing virtue, and so forth. These four topics, the four genuine restraints.
Let's say, ta number ni ba de de. Then di samba de la ta di zundu se ge do. Ta zundu se on de ta de cheni ta ge de to la ta nga so indi phati de li jim di gong janda gom je so da re do. Ni de la de ni di ka se re ta pansam je le chi singo ta na zain se di ma thap de nge go se on di ya ma thap chene semba yan thuk de do na. Ani de di singo de so pha me ba che chi ni. Then ma yang de la teni ta naba de ko zundu gi naba chini ya ji de.
So third is enthusiasm, we could say. And so with that enthusiasm, if we really think about this four genuine restraints, it's kind of a meditation on karmic causes and results. It's, we're thinking about virtue and non-virtue and the results that they bring about and the wish to abandon one and develop the other and so forth. And so when we're meditating on those, if we get into these states where our mind is either becoming really dull and lax, or rather the opposite side, where our mind is becoming overactive and agitated, then we need to eliminate those obstacles to our meditation and re-engage with enthusiasm.
Zingmo chongni ta zingmo se de ma thap ni masa ba chaung gre wala ta de ya de kal masa ba da wo chana de ya long ze la yang ji ta san ji ge ji yuan dan zo da wo da lam ge yuan dan da wo da chu ge yuan dan la so ba te so dan de ani de ba da mu la so ba ko ya ka se de zing da zingmo le de ya long go gre o de ji ka chen ji san ji ge yuan dan ba la so bi go ni ya long ya de ni so that the Yibate did.
Ming la Carse were la di.
On the la DJ the San Rabden Zinto Sigibo.
Okay. And so the fourth is to literally says to hold your mind. And so what that means is when your mind is falling into these states of dullness and unclarity, then we need to rise ourselves out of that. We need to bring ourselves out of that or lift ourselves up. And we do that by way of thinking about the qualities of the Buddhas, the qualities of the path, the qualities of the Dharma. And that instills us with a sense of faith and devotion to the teachings, which brings our mind out of that state of dullness. And so the reason it's called holding the mind is that when your mind is becoming dull and unclear, like sleepy and so forth, you're no longer holding the mind. You've lost grips with your mind. And so by conceiving of or by thinking of, by bringing up these thoughts of the qualities of the Buddhas and the Dharma and so forth, that generates this faith and devotion, which raises you back up out of that dullness and allows you to hold to your mind again.
Number ngapa tela tene sem rab de njuko singejin do sen rabden jugos. Ta sen rabden jug se undi kala ta ngaso pedi ndelata kasere sem provada gobase. Ta zani ni matabe peji ta docha hido tomogo wangla shorti de pedeta namtula so wang de short pedetene sem de progundi kaptena tene dedi sem de jugore. Jotong kandichini jugore se de tene che khobi ki dungala sobata. Tendre tene chi chowa tila megundi kabla ane ko sem ya go de ate ma babjini ane pan juk to ba chang yores.
And so then the fifth one is to settle the mind or to place the mind. And so what does that mean to settle the mind? So it means that when we're having the opposite problem, we're no longer experiencing dullness, but our mind is agitated. Our mind is overactive. We're falling under the power of our attachment, aversion, ignorance. We're chasing after all of our thoughts. Then we need to bring our mind back down. We need to settle our mind. And we do that by thinking of the sufferings of samsara and trying to instill the sense of sorrow, which instead of having our mind raised up and over agitated, we try and bring it back down with this kind of sense of genuine sadness or genuine kind of renunciation at samsara and bring our mind back down to a workable place.
Oh, let's say that in this home Zangalata, Tadanga di Yangda Punjig. Kasere mixanda wote getting ila make Gomdong number de ne ta Raymondava number night so the goni jo or the chego doas.
And so just to come back and summarize it for a moment, then the practice of the four genuine restraints is focusing upon its focal objects are virtue and non-virtue. And then we conceive of or work with those virtues and non-virtues in 5 different ways.
Oh, let's say, ta young did some dodo vojita dina carreta. Ale tango, yanda pung yigidi game get said dingente. When is so lam drubia pache dang, tunche drubia reg do mendo, the yikiba zoya di carchembojiche.
And so again, to summarize here, in the beginning, when we're talking about these 4 genuine restraints, then we need to gain trust. We need to understand and gain trust in the fact that these non-virtues create obstacles in our mind, and that the opposite, these virtues, are actually helpers, and they are assisting us. And so we need to think about, how they function. Do they serve as obstacles? Do the virtues actually assist us? And then gain trust in that. So that's the first thing.
Ta yi chi chana yang ngaso te se nyam ya da wuji chena ma to ngaso sem de dran chang che la do na chi kang phe phu ma re te song chang ge ma ge thola nyam bar ma ya ni sem de gong ya ge che de la ane be do se de na ba ni ba de ko ya ni be ni ti thola gom ni o de se ko de se.
And so once we've gained that trust, then we need to apply that in some kind of focused way, in a more in a meditative equipoise. Otherwise, just thinking of that for a moment and then letting it go isn't going to be helpful for us at all. And so that's why first, once we have the trust, then second, we have the second point, which was to make effort.
Ta tela ko yaung di kala ta ngaso jinggo de lugura ta tela zundu ji go do ko. And so then
the next one is, so like when we're trying to meditate, we're going to have these obstacles to our meditation. So we need to maintain that enthusiasm. We need to be persistent with the practice.
Then this bed ma zaini tani musaba chasona then guzula subala teni ya kasis zaini ya hunya dan bed good shona Reba, that didn't intervala, bed good shona. Young Jing Kobi Dungala Sobala making ma Pubiach. That catching Sema Babche Tasona, Yahunya Chita, long Tasona, ma Pubiach, Nama Niguni, Gonkudos.
And then, if our mind falls, the next 2 are that if our mind becomes very dull and unclear and sleepy, then we need to do something to raise ourselves back out of that. Like I said before, like thinking of the qualities of the Buddhas and so forth. And then if on the opposite side, if our mind becomes overactive and, overactive and wild, then we need to bring it back down by thinking of the sufferings of samsara and so forth. So we need to bring our mind up or down depending upon the situation. If our mind is too unclear, then we need to raise it back up. If our mind is too active, we need to bring it back down.
That's
a general presentation. Now I've finished my kind of general presentation of the 4 genuine restraints.
Then chui tam ye chetang ka se tong ni ge ngol mang chwa de tan pa gu bas gong hu then da wo tan pa hu de rang thusum che ge bas.
And so from the beginning then we worked with the four close applications of mindfulness, and those are primarily talking about the view of reality. We're talking about establishing things with our discriminating intelligence, with our wisdom. And so we are then establishing and seeing that all things are emptiness, right?
Ta tendis jeni ta tongni le ta le pabni nguni hiruk ta kasri ki thatogu ngo dawote ta le phat cha yona yang deni ngaso lang ta ngachen ngachen te so pang tinchen te so madam na yang phe thu yo mare ta te cheung ding ngachen te so pha pang tinchen te so chad drubya la ani dana di yang da pong ji seni ko pe tembre malba chang chi de tembre di chui tong di ka se tu so na ya tembre ge na wa de jesa len ro yo re te cheung de lang ko pa che te so de pha pang wa che de la ani di yang da pong ji de lab de gi dos.
And so then even though in the beginning we may have fully established with our wisdom, fully established that all things are emptiness, then there are still, obstacles to our practice. So if we don't eliminate those obstacles, and if we don't try to generate those supportive conditions, then we're not going, just knowing things are emptiness isn't going to help us all that much. And so it's said that, that the interdependence, it's like the clearer our experience of emptiness is, then the more clearly we will see the process of interdependence and the importance of these practices of avoiding non-virtues and developing virtues and so forth. And so it is then once we've established emptiness that we have to develop, we have to engage ourselves in these 4 genuine restraints in order to eliminate those obstacles to the path and develop or put into place those supportive conditions in our path.
Chanda di jana ta nga da ji tene moda tong ya ge tene ngarang ge zubo da moda ge chachen chama chong ina yang tene lam lan do di tene di pang go ya so pang drug go ya so madab na tene yang ka chen ji ko tang hina ya phe tho kum do da ro di kangan cha do do pe ten da wor re do was.
And so like as an example, like let's say I'm going to drive a car, and I've got the car and I've got, my body, which is able to drive the car. But when I actually go out into the path, I don't avoid the things that I should avoid. And I don't do the things that you're supposed to do when you drive a car. Then I'm going to get myself into a lot of trouble and I'm not going to be able to arrive where I want to arrive. Right?
And then the song da muni ge tong ni ge dan de ka se thong so aina ta muni tembre ge dan se de de tene pe ha le ya ge tene ko sabo cha do yo ta ji ji chung se chang ge le ten ji ni ta na ba chaman jon ru yo ba ta ko ngom som thong yo ba ta da di ka ngom som da ya yo ma re ta ko ka se de di chu ge ni lo ngom som zek se ge de yo ma re te ne ka chen ko ji den ji ni ta ji ba chang ge chen chu ge go ni o ta muni ji jin de ji jen de ji cha so wa ne chui de de ji jo du ge yang de le jen de ji de jen de ji chen na de ji jo du yo ba te ta nga so sa bu muni ko dong ta tong ni xin ge ji ge ne te pe sa bu thong du ge Ta machine chi ina na tani ta ka jin taro ma do rinda jin ro chi ba nga to ni tu de ye se chi sem no la zipo do wi ga chi de nguni ki ka se ni lo pha gi jam ga do ya ki yores.
And so the more that one realizes, the more clearly one realizes emptiness, then the more clearly they will see the conventional or the interdependent reality. And they'll see that even through the smallest change in one condition, that can affect, have a really great effect by even just the smallest change in one condition, then the result of that process can be tremendously transformed. And they see that very clearly. It's not as if they see it directly, because at this point in our description of the paths, of the 5 paths, the vision of emptiness is not what we refer to as direct realization, but it's you can infer by the understanding, by your inferential and by your still intellectual understanding of emptiness, you can infer that even small changes in the process of interdependence can create enormous results. And so, that's something that someone who has a good understanding of emptiness will know clearly. And people who only make a pretense of understanding emptiness and who think they do, and they make a lot of pretenses about knowing it, get themselves in a lot of trouble because they like to think they know emptiness, but they don't. And then they make a lot of mistakes in terms of their conduct.
Jimse karre sedi ke yang ngo madap sadi ke yang jondu yota jo chupare.
And so the reason is, if nothing exists as being something singular or solid, that means that it can become anything.
Oh, let's say any touch to J, the shit sound of Daya, I'm to Nagi or Silla.
So I've already been talking for an hour. I'm probably hurting your ears.
Let's say any chenamba di Tawaka Hiji on a J, ya, and then also the name the Nansam Jagi Silla.
So you guys should ask a few questions and then we're going to call it a night. So there's one question here that says, what is the meaning of emptiness? For example, emptiness of suffering or emptiness of happiness.
Oh.
Dunga di tomba ni racing and tang tipo de tony racing and de la candichico lencoris.
Oh, let's say. Kachenchi tomba se undukabla, and in aso Pagiji Ningbo Rawuchi. Dodu Rawuchi, Mrangage. And Richila Ketang the Coco des.
So just generally speaking, the important point when we say empty or emptiness is that there's no, things don't have any singular or solid essence. Like there's nothing solidly there that is the thing that we think it is.
Pena,
like when you look over at me, and so, like, for example, let's take me as an example. You might say that you're Khenpo, right? But then if I were to ask you, so is this over here Khenpo or is this Khenpo? And if I took all of those parts of me, every piece of me apart and asked you if each of them is Khenpo, you would say no, right? None of those things are Khenpo. And so, like, when I think about that, then all of those things that you took and that we took and talked about, those are all my things. Like they're not me. So, like, for example, this is my ear, my eye, my nose, and so forth. But there's no me. There's only my. And it's exactly the same when we talk about my car or my house. It's just a thing that this supposed I possesses. No one thinks that their house is part of them or is them, right?
I'm the song that I need to don't let the non there is singing to do ragamares.
So if I needed to say what is me, I can never find any solid thing to show you to say this is me.
Taina the chatang the dom che, and the decal around the same the ngai some depa yam the jerche, and a casting nga chagres.
But in my mind, I take all of those things and I kind of hold them together, and then my mind thinks that's me, and then that's how I operate. That's how I create this me.
And then this song that de la nangba garse tongba da nixigare. Tong se di Sani dodunda uji mravi chatela tongse. Nixse undikabla ina yang ko chik tsukpi top digoni ngaso chik dodu ji mena yang tsukpi top digoni lega kare ina tsama che denge pene nga jodunge chu hien ronge tane tende la sopa pene me che ina kangba deso tsik ronge tane ta kase de che ina ngaso di ka tongna ka komya soya la sopa lega na tsama che ronge. Really, in the past, Jogdona, then Jakaware, country race, Lazona, Meche Ragiomare, Cheche Ragiomare, Meche Ragiomare, that Tindichilla, then Nixe, Tomba, the Nixe, then this jealous.
And so in Buddhism, we talk about the word empty and emptiness. The ness and the empty refer to different things. So when we say empty, we mean that when you try to find something, you never find some solid thing that is the thing that you think it is. But when all of those pieces or parts come together, then those things can still function. Like, for example, I still function as a person. I can run around. I can teach the Dharma, whatever. Fire, even though fire doesn't truly exist in and of itself, when the conditions come together for fire, it can still burn down your house. Water can still clear away your thirst. But when you seek out those individual things, you never find some solid, singularly existing thing, which is the thing you were seeking for. But when those things come together, they still function in a way. So when the fact that we don't find them is what we call empty. When even though there isn't something that we can find which is solid and singular and truly existing, when the causes and conditions come together for them to appear, they still function. That's the ness, so emptiness, like that.
And then this on the Sanji Chu de la ta Gaseredi, then rare cigarette. Chigla teni, then Gasere de tunge. Coordinate and Japan Rovina, Japan in Tervala. Chigla teni, take de tugre. Mado Chibuti could de to Yomar. That didn't but Sama Suni patents de Cheundi couldn't date again. De mena anikasene chig Rajme Varavas.
So this is also talked about in the Buddhist teachings as the teaching of interdependence. And so what that means is that, for example, like if you have two sticks and you just sit them on the ground like this, they can't stay up by themselves, but when they lean together, they can hold themselves up. And so, all things, nothing is able to stand on its own. Nothing is anything in and of itself. It's always being, appearing or existing or functioning by its interdependence with other things. Is emptiness shunyata cause by cause? Sorry, Noble, I don't understand the question. Is this emptiness shunyata caused by cause, aware of interdependence? Yeah, I don't understand the question, Noble, to ask Kempo. Could you try and rephrase it? If I understand what you're saying, emptiness isn't something which understands things. So emptiness and interdependence are two ways of talking about the same thing. They're not two different things where one is aware of the other. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but. To a chick the shot the day and yaporang go to them doing a party shibi and they chick the la yancher tes stretch jam the matanga yapo go to them do shibi in la.
Let's say
Tanda chick yancher chick let mason la.
Let's say
Noble, are you working on a new? Okay, there we go. If we are more aware of interdependence? Oh, okay, yeah. Da nga so di tendra gi chi kare se wore goa do chi ta to ba do chi jesel do chi cha so na nga di nga so tomba ni la chi goa de ni chi jesel droga de besa.
Ore da tongba ni korong la tendra se ki ore. Da te in da is. Ko pe di.
Yeah, Khen Rinpoche said, yeah, of course, if we're more aware of interdependence, then we'll be more aware of shunyata because interdependence is just another name for shunyata. Shunyata is the Sanskrit for emptiness, for those of you that didn't know that term.
Ko di tada temdre singe de la ko ni yore. So jing ni temdre se undi tongba ni rang la ko de ni yore. So jing ni temdre se undi jijen chu som na de ni di ya ya ba jik ta ni yore si de da temdre tharanda wu ji re.
So there's two ways of talking about interdependence. And one way we talk about interdependence, we say that it's identical to emptiness. And in another way, we say that interdependence is the mere coming together of causes and conditions to create some kind of appearance. And so they're the same meaning, but there's a bit of a difference in terms of like the subtlety or more obvious understanding of the two. Page science are to
Let's say, let's say, any thought in the Netrava Chinese, any tongue a Jiman de la Dinima, Deni, that day. Temane Yanda, Temane Yanda, that Zumperdi come by year.
No.
The hita so any ta Cassiri Jima Dinimata, Drogi Insula.
And so I think we're finished for tonight. And in the next teaching, then we're going to move into the next topic of the 37 factors, which is the 4 bases of miraculous powers.
Let's say, any teaching about the Muntu Tada di Nyend Young so enough. Any chick near Katung here, Yajita, train here, Yajita, church, Yam the Edge in the road of Jeda. Any Chiron Mama loan, any Chester, do Yagres.
And so for those of you who want to continue in this cycle of teachings and listening to these teachings, I would encourage you to try and take your understandings from last week's teaching and this week's teaching and kind of join them together and try and understand those as one clear picture. And then as we move forward, adding more and more information, then it'll become more and more clear. This whole path will become more and more clear.
That's it. Oh, let's say any or that train not any yagi say let's say.
All right, so I'm going to leave it here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Hey, good night.
Sonam de tamje
Zipani tamnani be dana tamde ji. Ega nam ji walam tu bai sigbin solen roba drober shu.